I think that we can start.
Perfect, let's do it.
Yes, so I talk to the public. So welcome to this 12th appointment of the conference series organized by the Centro Camuno di Studi Preistorici, named Parlando di Arte Rupestre, which is talking about rock art. So it's a great pleasure to have here with us tonight, or this morning, if you're in West Canada, Genevieve von Petzinger, an author that I've heard for the first time in 2009, so some time ago, when I first arrived in Canada, where I did my PhD in Montreal in particular. So 11 years ago, she had been mentioned at the Radio Canada, where she was already talking about what is her main interest, that is the interpretation of prehistoric abstract or geometric signs as a form of writing. Of course, the definition of the word of writing is what counts a lot in this topic. Since then, she has accomplished so many things. She's a Canadian paleoanthropologist, author. She's a speaker and explorer who in particular studies Ice Age art and the origins of graphic communication. Genevieve's specific focus is on the geometric signs found at many of these sites, and she's interested in how these enigmatic markings can help us to better understand the human cognitive evolution, as well as the development of symbolic thought and the modern mind during this early chapter in prehistory. Her research has been extensively featured both nationally and internationally in print, radio, and on television, along with receiving the 2016 National Geographic Emerging Explorer Award. Genevieve is also a TED Senior Fellow, and her TED Talk has been viewed more than 8 million times. So with this conference series, we are far from that. Maybe Genevieve has some secret that would like to share with us to have so many views, but for now, our compliments for that result. I would also like to mention that she published a book entitled The First Signs, Unlocking the Mysteries of Our World's Oldest Symbols, edited in 2016 by Atria Books. Of course, today is the 8th of March, so it's also a great pleasure to host her talk today. This is Women's Day, of course, and this event might also be an opportunity for wishing Happy Women's Day to everyone. As a man, I would also like to wish Happy Women's Day to my fellow men, just for remembering that if we have the expression "of the sky," if I say it correctly, among the two words "af" and "sky," I think that "af" should prime over the other, even if it's more romantic, sky. But let's not forget about the "af," which is also more quantitative, less romantic, but it talks about other things. So for not forgetting that we're not alone, and we live in a plural world, and that this world is magnificent because it is plural. So let's continue our effort in maintaining our greatest respect for all the differences that surround us. I will now give the floor to Genevieve von Petzinger, which will be talking about the Paleolithic Signs and the origins of graphic communication. So Genevieve, you have are you there?
I'm here, yes.
Very good.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the wonderful introduction. And hello, everybody.
Yeah.
It's always a pleasure to have a chance to talk about my favorite subject. So I'm going to share my PowerPoint so we can get going. And yeah, as Matteo was saying, we're going to actually move through a couple of continents. We're going to move through quite a few millennia. So if people have questions, sometimes it might make sense to answer them while we're still in that region or that time period. So again, feel free to jump in if it seems like it's appropriate. Sometimes questions really get to the most interesting stuff at all, because I'm just trying to cover the big structure, right? All right, so let me just try and bring up my PowerPoint.
Yes.
Okay. So I just wanted to sort of preface my talk by saying that, you know, I mean, obviously many of the people watching will also be rock art researchers. And I mean, I think for all of us, you know, certainly the art is pretty and we like studying it just because, you know, it's interesting and aesthetically pleasing. But I mean, I think for most of us, the real sort of the real draw is trying to understand, you know, why were people doing it, and, you know, how far back does it go, and, you know, what can it tell us about the sort of the origins of the modern mind, which is really where I see art as having this really unique place into, like, is this window of insight, because it's a little bit different. It's non-utilitarian. It's not the same as tools or other things which, you know, you need to survive. Making art is superfluous in a way, like it's something you do with your spare time, unless it's very important and central for reasons that we will discuss. But so I think for me, that's part of what I find so fascinating about the Paleolithic, is that this is a time period when we see things happening for the first time so often, that it's a lot of fun to try and understand why and where, and, you know, what was going on. And so certainly for me, that's kind of what underlies my work, are those sorts of questions pretty much inform everything. And I think the other big thing with paleoanthropology is, you know, this is such an exciting time to be working in the field, in the sense that it seems like literally like every week or two, there's some incredible announcement of a new discovery, and there's like a new species, or there's like, you know, the age of rock art was pushed back by another 5,000 years, or, you know, there's another entire country that suddenly has rock art that didn't before. And so, you know, it feels like it's a really great time to be in the field. It's also, I feel like, a time where it's very important to be flexible in your theories, because, you know, what you think, you know, this week, what's the expression? Like, I feel like we're at a place where we know just enough about the Paleolithic that we know how much we don't know. And so, you know, like everything that I'm saying today, I mean, please take within that context, which is that I do tend to like to think up big theories. Sometimes I'm right, sometimes I'm wrong. But I feel like this is a field where there's space for that, and that there's just there's so much potential to understand with new things like new dating techniques, with like genetics and all these wonderful high-tech tools, which we can now bring to try and answer some of the oldest questions in the world. So that's just
true. If I can just say a word, on this same sort of things that you are saying, I think that this sort of prehistoric studies also teaches us the respect for the plural that I was talking about earlier, because every day we get to know that our ancestors back in the old times, they were doing incredible things. So it is this kind of discoveries, they are kind of deconstructing, you know, the traditional theory that sees them as inferior and like not mentally developed, and us.
like primitive.
So
kind
I
of
think
thing.
there is really an ethic, something ethic that we can learn from all this.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, that's definitely, that's how I try and approach the field as well, is that sort of a sense of humility that, you know, at any point I could be proved completely wrong. But, you know, and that's what science is all about, right? And I welcome it. I'm excited to see what we will discover next, but I have no doubt it will be interesting. So this is for me, though, also why, even though I tend to study the Paleolithic time period in Europe, like the Upper Paleolithic, I like to start by looking further back, because I believe it is all really interconnected. And so I wanted to start today with just quickly touching on some of our colleagues' research in Africa, because I believe it is quite relevant to what we're talking about today. Speaking of new discoveries, I mean, if I was giving this talk a couple of years ago, we would be saying Homo sapiens were 200,000 years old, right? And now, thanks to the work of colleagues in North Africa, we've now got evidence that Homo sapien is at least 300,000 years old. So again, our species is a little older than we thought. And of course, it's more of a question of evolving traits, as opposed to there suddenly one day being a hard line in the sand of Homo sapiens. So around this time, all of the right traits to come together for us to be able to identify these individuals as modern, but anatomically modern humans, or Homo sapien like us. So that's happening 300,000 years ago. Again, it's important to point out that it really wasn't that long ago, like 20 some odd years ago, that they thought the oldest art and symbolic behavior was in Europe. And that was really more like started around 35,000 years ago. So even just like in that short time period, our understanding has changed so much, including how we define symbolic behavior. And so I wanted to start just by touching really briefly on ochre, which of course is used to make cave art paintings in Europe and is used for many other purposes and remains in use around the world. It's a very popular pigment for making paint. Of course, it's iron oxide as the mineral. And it comes in varying shades depending where you are, and you can often harvest it from sort of outcroppings and other things. And what I find so fascinating though is that in Africa, there's examples of them harvesting ochre and curating it like close to 300,000 years ago. And so again, you know, if you're looking for behavior that, you know, would consider to be symbolic, this is certainly one option. Now, ochre has a lot of very practical uses. It can be used as insect repellent. I've heard it has some medicinal properties potentially. It can be used to haft spearheads onto spears. Like there's lots of very practical purposes for ochre. So again, if you see it at a site, you can't automatically get really excited because it could have been one of those more mundane uses. But there's a site in Africa called the Twin Rivers site in Zambia, for instance, where there was regular red ochre, but there was also this wonderful sort of sparkly purple ochre. And so again, the sparkly purple ochre was farther from the site. So if you're just using ochre for regular old boring purposes, the color of it doesn't matter. But if you're using it because you also wish to look fabulous, the extra distance makes it worth it, right? So I think that that's where those are those tiny glimmers that you see even that far back in the archaeological record, is that our ancestors were making decisions not just based on, you know, pure ease, like, oh, the red stuff's closer, but they're like, you know what? I like, you know, something about the properties of the purple one with the sparkles appealed, which, you know, as a fellow modern human makes sense. So I think those are those very first glimmers that we're finding in the archaeological record. And so again, I would say that just like with so many things in this field, that I expect more will be found. I suspect that the fact that we don't have it yet is not so much that it doesn't exist as in people just haven't been looking for it, or they haven't known what they're seeing. And so again, more research, hopefully more funding can go into parts of the world where it hasn't been before, which will, I hope, start to open this up, because I suspect there's probably more of these examples that go much further back than we previously thought. So starting with ochre, because it's always very fun.
Of course, it's a very good idea. Just something, Genevieve. Can I ask you if you can speak maybe a little slower for helping our European non-English speaker friends to follow, just slightly?
No problem.
But not.
No
I
problem.
don't want to interfere with your pace.
With my flow. No, I'm sorry. I get excited. I talk fast. So no, I can definitely, we can slow it down. See, if we were in person, I'm much better at being slow if I'm standing up on a stage. But of course, this just feels like we're having a Zoom chat. So just gotta remember there is an audience. It's not just us.
Yeah.
But yeah, so starting with our old ochre example, I'm gonna fast forward 200,000 years. And because this was a very exciting discovery, which of course also happened in the last couple of years. And this is from the very famous site of Blombos in South Africa. And it currently holds the record for the oldest ochre drawing in the world. Now, again, that could change next week, but at the moment it's the oldest at 73,000. And as you can see, there's some red marks that have been sort of drawn onto this piece. Now, what's quite interesting about it is, of course, the way it was found when they were sifting. So again, there's so much that who knows what we've missed or what we weren't looking for before, that I think this is a really good example of, I suspect we will find more in the future. But it is really interesting to find, you know, we know they were curating ochre. We have these examples of them with ochre in many sites across Africa in the Middle Paleolithic. And yet we didn't know what they were doing with them. And so here's one example, of course, with it on rock, which gives us a hint. I also suspect, as I know do many of my colleagues, that the earliest, honestly, the earliest canvas probably was the human body. And of course, that leaves no record. There's no permanent record of that, but I would suspect that probably they were also experimenting with putting imagery and coloring onto themselves as well. And that may very well have started to give them the idea of different surfaces too. So we've got our ochre drawing. which is currently the oldest in the world. But we have, of course, have even older engraved markings too. So I love this image from Henshelwood et al. This is from the when they were announcing the ochre. But if you look at the layering at the site, I mean, look how rich it is. Look at all of the marks. Like, this is just from one cave. And so, you know, there's others as well. I mean, Classie's Rivermouth, I believe they found some engravings. Pinnacle Point, they have, like, it's really starting to amplify now. But Blombos definitely remains kind of a show site when it comes to having lots of engravings that go sort of as far back as we currently know in Africa. And so, of course, we can see it goes all the way, that in a funny way, the ochre drawing actually seems kind of new. When you look below it, you can see all these other engraved marks, which go all the way back to around 100,000 BP, and which are, you know, potentially a little simpler at that point, but we're still seeing marks that the researchers at that site have confirmed are deliberate. They were not, like, these are not, like, they're thought to have been made with some sort of purpose in mind, even if we don't know quite what that is, but that these were not accidental. These were not like the side effect of sharpening a tool, that these were actually deliberate markings. And just to give you a closer look, these are the 100,000-year-old markings. And so we can see that it's kind of a series of lines that sort of angles in at the bottom. Again, who knows, but it's you know, it's those simple beginnings, right? And to me, when I'm looking at these, what I see as being so important is, you know, it was that the cognitive leap that they made, whether it's here, whether it's 100,000 years earlier, maybe even farther. We can talk about that later. But that, you know, it was that point at which they started storing information outside the body. And I think, to me, this is a really critical moment in our cognitive development as a species. Because as long as, you know, communication is verbal, as long as, you know, there's no way to record or preserve things, there's not that same sense of permanence. It's also almost a different mindset. So once they started being able to actually make these permanent marks, these markings took on a life of their own in a way. And they had longevity beyond the moment at which they were being used, even by those individuals. They could be retrieved later. Other individuals could also take a look at them, and if the cultural context was there, potentially understand what they were. And so this is a very, very powerful moment in our species history, whether this was at Blombos, whether it happened sooner. But those first very simple marks, they might not look like much, but I believe that the underlying implications of what they represent are earth-shattering in a way, and that this is partly what has really laid the foundation for everything that we are now capable of doing today when it comes to computers and mathematics and sending rovers to Mars. Like, all of those things, funnily enough, to me anyways, start with these very humble beginnings and with these first attempts to, you know, artificially store information outside the body.
Genevieve, because I feel like it's a good dialogue that I can do with you, I interrupt you for a question that popped up out in Facebook. Yeah. So it's a tough one. So Liana is asking, how do you determine if markings seem deliberate or as a side effect of tool usage?
Yeah.
Up to you.
Okay, so I am not the expert on this. One of the world experts is Dr. Francesco D'Errico. He works at Bordeaux in France. And so generally speaking, if I'm saying something's deliberate, it's because somebody like Francesco, whose opinion I absolutely trust on this, is stating this. And they do an incredible amount of experimental archaeology there. And it's not just him, other researchers do it as well. I just happen to know Francesco's work quite well. And what they're doing is that when things are the side effect, if things are a natural crack, they look at these artifacts under scanning electron microscopes. So they're able to look at them with incredible detail. And the types of troughs that are made by the tools are different depending on what they're doing with it. If a line is sort of just being made by accident by a tool, I believe sometimes the way, like, the depth and the hardness are different than it can be if it's being made deliberately. So again, Francesco was the one they brought in when they had their, I love I love the modern era. The hashtag that they found in Gibraltar there, which was in a Neanderthal site, that was Francesco they brought in, who not only looked at it, he tried replicating it somewhere else in a different cave. So a lot of very deliberate, very hard science goes into making these assessments as to whether something is deliberate and purposeful as opposed to a side effect of it. Kind of like I was, with the bones, right? Like, are the markings on the bones because they were, basically cutting the meat off, or are there markings on bones that are very deliberate markings? And so they use many of the same techniques with that. But there's a lot of very fantastic science around experimental archaeology and using very high resolution imagery, and then a lot of actually replication where they try it and see what does it look like if we do it different ways, and then they build up almost like a reference library they can use. So how's that? Hopefully that was a pretty good explanation.
Yeah, absolutely.
Good. So yeah, no, I have huge admiration. I'm not an expert in that myself, but I believe them when they tell me. I know they put the work in. How's that? So okay, so we're talking about our engravings, and I wanted to, before we leave Africa, which, like I said, I see so much potential in that continent. I think there's so much waiting to be found there, and I can't wait to read my colleagues' papers in the future as they uncover all these wonderful things. But I sort of wanted to leave Africa with what my colleagues in Africa have proposed could be some potential meanings, as well as, of course, looking at the wonderful eggshell engravings from deep kloof rock shelters. So many of these are between 60 and 80,000 years old. That's what we're looking at. And as you can see, the patterns are becoming more complex. And what I love so much about deep kloof rock shelter, of course, is that the same patterns repeat across generations. And so it opens up some very interesting questions about the fact that, it's obviously very purposeful if they're replicating the same design in multiple layers, so that this is something that's being preserved and repeated as a tradition, as opposed to somebody saying, just sort of whipping some marks off. So some proposals that have been made in Africa, some people have said, well, it could just be decorative, and that there's sort of an aesthetic appeal to it, which again, even the idea of making decorative marks, which could be something we do find in the archaeological record, it still implies a certain level of like cognitive ability and aesthetic appreciation. Like, I still feel like even decorative marks still tell us important things about sort of the modernity of the mind. Doodles are interesting because they're often sort of written off as being, irrelevant. But from everything that I've read about them, doodles still seem to apparently be like sort of culturally directed, in the sense that you won't doodle things that aren't like imagery from your own culture because you wouldn't know about it. So that even within that, there still could be, even if they're just doodling for fun or not really paying attention, they're still replicating things that are culturally known. So there's still, again, a sense of purposefulness and meaningfulness to it, even if it's not some deep meaning. Then, of course, what's been proposed for these eggshells and also for some of the ochre pieces from Blombos is that they could be some sort of owner's mark. So just as simple as letting you know that who this piece of ochre belonged to, or the eggshells, of course, at Deep Kloof come from the ostrich eggs, and they were using them as water bottles. So again, nobody wants to share anybody else's water bottle. It's still a thing. So why not put your name on it, right? Or your family group. And that's, the other thing as well is that, with family or tribal signs, some of these could have been, again, group signs that applied to people living in that particular cave or that location, or maybe even culturally within caves. So, again, marks don't have to be complex in order to still carry a lot of really interesting meaning, at least in my opinion. So there's my argument for simple marks.
That's a good one. The mug with the name on it is a good one.
I know, right? Because we still feel that way. All right. So I want to sort of talk then about why does this matter? And why am I starting in Africa? Why are we talking about Africa when really I'm here to talk to you about the Upper Paleolithic in Europe? And to me, why this matters is that I really do believe it is all interconnected. And part of that comes back to, again, I was rambling on at the beginning there about, the wonderful technologies at our disposal and how it's changing the way we're able to approach this field. And to me, one of the most powerful technologies we've added is genetics. And in particular, what I find so intriguing about the marks is the fact that humans haven't, like Homo sapien, we've made it out of Africa. Our ancestors have made it out several times. Basically, when the conditions are correct in the Near East and North Africa, humans are curious, they go. What genetics has told us, though, is that all of the people who are alive today on Earth are descended from the most recent exit. So the extant populations around the world, genetically speaking, are all related to that 60 to 70,000 year ago window when people left Africa. What's even more interesting is that genetics has sort of traced it back. At this point, this seems to be the best sort of understanding, to an area in East Africa, which had one particular haplogroup. So that's the genetic group, is called the L haplogroup. And that everybody who left is descended from that L haplogroup. Even more interesting is the fact that it seems to have been a very small number of individuals who left over time. And so again, we're talking small groups ranging out. We're not talking about hundreds of thousands of people. In fact, I've seen numbers as small as potentially it being like 10,000 people who populated the entire old world, and even into the new world. So that's not a lot of people. We've got them in the same location. We've got the same haplogroup. Likely it's the same culture. And if we're talking about the same culture, I believe, I mean, based on what we're seeing in Africa, in South Africa and in other places within the continent, that there's no doubt that these people already had some sort of graphic tradition when they left. And knowing how closely related they were, I don't find it surprising that we find portable artifacts with markings and cave art everywhere we go. The oldest examples we have of humans being there, we find these items as well. Because to me, and again, this is just my opinion, not everyone's going to agree, but I really do believe that it was part of the cognitive toolkit. And it went with them where they went around the globe. And that this is why, again, certainly with the simple geometric signs that I study, we often find a lot of similarity in what we're seeing in different places around the world as well. And, I think that, again, goes to the fact that when they first left, the toolkits would have been similar. And then over time, what we see, of course, is that, the people in Australia are no longer talking to the people in, Europe. And so we start to see cultural divergence taking place, and we see all these amazing art traditions that head off in their own trajectories. But when you look at the really early stuff, there seems to potentially be a little more similarity. This is something I'm hoping to study more in the future. And I also feel like there's a lot of blank spaces on the map that we really need to fill in order to start connecting the dots better. Pardon the pun. It's my bad geometric sign pun. But again, I mean, dots are one of the really early ones, right? So I would suspect that we will find dots to connect, hopefully, in some of these places. But again, it requires working in parts of the world where we traditionally, haven't had as much presence there. So places like the Near East, places through Eurasia, like following those genetic lines, which we have now, and the archaeology is there as well, and actually starting to work in these other zones, we may be able to start filling it in. So that's my hope. I hope in the future we will see less blank spots on the map. But this is also why I believe it's important that when we're talking about what we're seeing in Europe, I believe we're seeing the continuation of an existing tradition, which is why from the time they step foot on that continent, they're already making beautiful art. And I think that's where I believe at the moment, and again, could change next week, I believe at the moment, Bačko Kiro in Bulgaria is the oldest spot example we have of people in Europe, Homo sapiens in Europe anyways. And I think it's around 47,000 BP. And they do have some portable pieces which had a few geometric markings on them. No wall art yet, but we do have some portable stuff. So, there is that hint again that they're there. They're bringing their culture and their traditions with them. And then, as I said, over time, we will see that change because that's how what culture does, it changes. But that to me is kind of the start point, and that larger context within which I'm studying the art in Europe is within that idea of it being part of this longer continuum. And so that's kind of to set the scene for you, if you will. So there's just sort of, again, by 50,000, we see them starting to push in. And by 45,000, I think now we've got them. I think it's 43,000 for Spain is the current oldest. So we've got them pretty much populating the continent by then. So welcome to Paleolithic Europe. We made it. We've made our journey.
Welcome.
I know, right? Yeah. So I can't wait to be back there in person myself. Hopefully later this year. But you know, and I love this image, and I wanted to put it up here. I know it's not, you know, it's not just like a technical image, but you know, I think that's the thing, is that when we're looking this far back, as Matteo was saying, you know, traditionally we've thought of these ancient people as being very primitive, of being like sort of different than us or lesser than us. But you know, the more we learn, I think the more we realize that they're really just us, and that, you know, not only in their physical appearance but also cognitively. At this point, I would say, I don't even think there's that many people left who would argue that we're not talking about fully modern cognitive people by the time we're talking about this. I would say it goes back, honestly, into Africa, that we were already there before then. And so I think what we're seeing, though, is that, you know, wherever people go around the world, we're going to talk about Europe today, but you know, that they're doing incredibly innovative things, just like we would, right? And so we're seeing them adapt to their environment. We're seeing them build interesting housing. The artifacts they're creating are amazing, which of course I don't have time to talk about today. But, you know, and even things like their sewing needles, and, you know, because again, clothing matters a lot more when it's really cold in an ice age. So, you know, it's wonderful to see, what's the expression? Necessity is the mother of invention. And I feel like our ancestors were incredibly good at that, at sort of being like, okay, here's the problem, let's figure out the solution. And I really believe the more I study, because I tend to look at a lot of Europe, very sort of like cross-regionally. I'm interested in, you know, different countries, different regions, and sort of the interactions that, you know, I think one of our secrets of our success, if you will, has really been, and it sounds funny since it's so big now, is our social networking skills. It feels like our ancestors were already very good at making friends with their neighbors, and recognizing the fact that, you know, again, not that there wasn't violence sometimes, but that overall, the overall theme seems to be much more cooperative. And it makes sense when you're in these very harsh environments, that you would want to be friends with your neighbors in case something went wrong where you were. It would be really handy to be able to go ask for help. This is also where you're going to find your marriage partners. These are the people that you're going to trade with. And I've seen some incredible examples of the trade networks they already had. What was it? I think there was like some shells from the Mediterranean they found up in Siberia. I mean, that's like 1,000 kilometers away. It's incredible. And they were trading things like amber and obsidian, which again, we can track chemically sometimes back to their source, you know, so they have these huge complex networks. And of course, we can assume that, you know, they're talking to each other, obviously, too, so that they're going to be sharing culture and ideas and potentially symbols as well, right?
Yeah,
so
it's true.
Yeah.
Actually, I don't think I'm going to spoil something, because you're going through the Upper Paleolithic, but that is so true. There is a theory that I agree with, that actually Homo sapiens took advantage on Neanderthal, because the social bonding, the social connections were more strong and more, they extended on a larger area, while it seems that the Neanderthal, even if mentally equipped as we are, they were a little bit more solitary. So this was a sort of problem for the development of greater things that they could do, but they were like too solitary. This is one theory.
Yeah, no, it's a theory I've heard before too. And again, overall I would agree with it as well, which is that, you know, with humans, and I think you can see it, which is that a new type of tool will be invented, and you can watch it move across Europe. Like, they're sharing their information. Whereas with Neanderthals, I've seen really interesting stuff where, you know, there's certain groups of them somewhere that actually invent some very sophisticated tool technology. It never goes anywhere. Like, it doesn't seem like they're sharing. So I see what you mean, that they don't, you know, I think cultural buffering is, I think, the term I've heard used, you know, can be a very powerful tool. And so it does seem like maybe Neanderthals just weren't used to requiring it or using it. And again, I think the number of them in Europe, the population was really low, even before we showed up. And so it may be that they didn't honestly connect much interregionally. Whereas, you know, our our ancestors in Europe seem to have been quite mobile. Like there really seems to have been a lot of movement back and forth. And I mean, they're even crossing the Alps and stuff. Like unless it's the height of the last glacial maximum, I mean, they're going across mountain ranges. Like things are just moving everywhere. So it feels like maybe they had different social and cultural patterns that may have assisted them as the weather took sort of a downward turn, and that maybe the Neanderthals just didn't have that same sort of backup plan like we did. So yeah, no, I think it's definitely an interesting theory. So I wouldn't be surprised if it continues to kind of bear fruit, you know, in the coming years as we learn more. But yeah, so much we could talk about. I'm going to talk about art though, since, you know, that's what I'm here for. That's what Matteo invited me to talk about. So I wanted to start just by saying that, you know, again, Upper Paleolithic rock art, of course, mostly in caves, rock shelters, but now, of course, we do have open air art as well, which is so exciting. You know, in places like Coa Valley in Portugal. I've heard that in Valcamonica, there may even be a few late Paleolithic images. So that's really exciting. And it's incredible to think that it's actually, you know, survived out in the open in these places for so long. But I also, you know, when you look at the caves, I mean, you realize that like it's such an unusual environment that like acts as like this little mini preservation, you know, bubble, right? But when you see places like the Coa Valley or Valcamonica, you know, it gives you a hint. Maybe I'm a bit of a romantic, but you know, when I picture the Paleolithic landscape and knowing that like what we have now is probably a fraction of the art that used to exist. You know, I mean, the landscape must have been incredible back then. I suspect it was really decorated. And that it must have been wonderful to walk around and see probably a lot more art in the open and all of these incredible things. So we're just catching a glimpse, I think, of what an incredibly, you know, artistically rich time it was. But even that glimpse is still very tantalizing, right? So at the moment we have just over 400 sites across Europe, and new ones are being found all the time, especially as people are moving into new regions, as I was mumbling about before. You know, my colleague, Dr. Ruiz Redondo, has been doing some incredible stuff in the Balkans and finding cave art in countries where previously there was none, like in Croatia, and he's expanding our knowledge in Bosnia and all these other wonderful things. And I believe he was part of a group that just found a second cave in Russia near Kapova Cave. And there is more woolly camels in it. So there we go. So, you know, so the number is expanding. How's that? The number is growing, which is wonderful. I'd love to see it grow more because every new cave we find, you know, if you think about it, 400 sites is such a small number for like a 30,000 year time period. Every time we find a new cave, we learn new things. And so, you know, certainly in my research, I'm always trying to think up ways that we can find more caves. So it's one of the things I spend a lot of time thinking about and looking at wonderful limestone valleys in different parts of the world. But, you know, because I'm sure there's more art out there, and I suspect that this number will continue to grow. It's just that understandably, preservation becomes incredibly complex when we're talking about, you know, this many thousands of years. So, and of course I had to show the purple bison from La Pasiaga, because purple is so rarely used in the art. And he's just so magnificent with so simple, and yet there's so much beauty in it. And I love the fact that I think it was about 5,000 years later, somebody else went into the cave and used black to touch up the purple bison. So I always love that as well, when you sort of see that, you know, future artists are also kind of coming into these caves and seeing what their ancestors also made, even if they don't know quite the time depth like we do. So it's a kind of a fun one. And of course, the other thing I was talking about before was the dating techniques and the importance of that in changing our understanding of so much when it comes to the art. Previously, when we only had carbon dating at our disposal, you know, there was a ceiling, really. That's the thing, is that, and again, the carbon dating has gotten so much better. They've managed to push the ceiling, but we're still in like the 45,000 year range, which is the absolute maximum at which you can really carbon date something. And again, you also need black paint made with organic material like charcoal, or that won't work. So as long as we only had carbon dating, we were very limited in a way in what we could do. We couldn't do engravings, we couldn't do red paintings. Like there were so many things that were outside the realm of what we could do. I included this one because I had the privilege of working in El Castillo a couple of times. And if you look, those are the little scalpel scrapes from where Alistair Pike and his team took some samples. This is what's underneath there is a red disc, actually, that's about the size of a teacup saucer. And so they were dating, of course, using the new uranium series dating technique, where they're measuring when the calcite covered up the painting. And so that's one example from El Castillo. That was, I believe, about 40,500 was the number they got back on that one. And then, of course, this one is a slightly more controversial, which is always fun. This is from the next cave over on the same, so also Monte Castillo. This is from La Pasiaga, which is next door. And this is one of the 65,000-year-old calcite samples that was also taken by like Pike et al. Were the ones who sampled it and then did the dating on it. So this is the piece. And again, you know, I mean, I think it's important to acknowledge that there's nothing wrong with debate and disagreement and making people prove things. I mean, that's what science is, right? And so I don't have a problem in that sense, in the fact that there is a group of scholars who disagree with the technique, the way it was used in these caves. And that so they're pushing back because, of course, if they're talking about 65,000-year-old plus paintings, there was no humans there then. So that implies it must be Neanderthals, right? And so for a whole lot of reasons, there's been some pushback on these. I think the uranium series dating, and this is just me, I'm not an expert in it. I understand what the concerns are of some of the other scholars when it comes to it being like an open cave and there being other reasons why the samples could be wrong. I still lean towards it being correct. How's that? That's just me personally. But I suspect as well that I should, you know, I guess I should let my bias out right now. I am Team Neanderthal. I do believe Neanderthals also made art. And I think it's just a matter of us figuring out how to prove that. And who was I joking? I was joking with some of my colleagues in Portugal about, you know, what we need is like a Neanderthal to like have a heart attack with like the ochre in his hand and collapse like right in front of the panel. So so there can be no doubt who made the art. But barring that, we'll have to keep looking. But I suspect that Neanderthals were also making cave art, and it's just going to be a matter of, you know, continuing to build on the work that's been done initially here, and looking for other ways to come at this question. But I think that uranium series has also been used very successfully in Indonesia. And of course, our colleagues there just pulled a 45,000-year-old date of a figurative image, which makes it the oldest figurative image in the world from a cave over there in Indonesia. And so congratulations to them, that's amazing. And, you know, who knows what we're gonna find next week, right? But I think that with these new techniques at our disposal and the ability now to date other colors, other techniques of rock art, I suspect that we will only uncover more. And I have a feeling that the theme in this, you know, the next couple decades in paleoanthropology will be, we've vastly underestimated the age of things. As I feel like this is really going to be us kind of like revisiting stuff and going, oh, it is older. And again, partially goes back to, like, I'd say bias from like the late 1800s, early 1900s as to how old things were, and that's just kind of filtered down, and then us not having the tools to truly dig into it, whereas now we're starting to get those tools and we're starting to realize how old some of these behaviors and practices really are. So I think there will be lots of more exciting discoveries in coming years for sure. So I may even know about one or two that I'm not allowed to tell about, but yes, exciting things I think are coming. So back to Europe. What's so interesting about the Paleolithic cave art is that it's currently divided into 3 themes, and all of the art is kind of sorted that way, basically. So the main theme that most people, I think of when we think of Paleolithic art, of course, is the animals, right? We think of the mammoth and the bison and the deer, and of course, the wonderful spotted horses at Cave like Peshmeral there on the right. Though even, I like that simple line deer is from Las Chimeneas in Spain. And there's something about it. It's simple, but so well done at the same time. And I think that's where that they were really expert in the way that they drew their animals. And we see that across, so many sites and, such a large area. But again, they're already very good at what they're doing here, which is where it is interesting to wonder where and when the oldest figurative drawings really took place. It's a good question. But again, we even have, of course, beautiful carved ivory figurines that are 40,000+ years old from places like Germany. So we know that they were very good with their animals. So animals account for most of the figurative imagery. I believe it's the horse and the bison in particular. I think I was reading not that long ago that they account for, I think it's like 60% almost of all animal drawings, certainly over 50, I think are either horse or bison, which is fascinating because they weren't always the main food source, and yet they're being depicted on walls all over the place. So I think that has some interesting implications for it being more than just about putting a menu on a wall. But again, I would say at this point, most people would argue that, a horse is not necessarily just a horse, right? That there can certainly be more things that are going on different levels with that. So that's the animals. For the humans, of course, I wanted to represent Italy. So here's the humans from Grotta della Dora in Sicily, where I had the pleasure of working. I love this one because, again, I'm sure many of our colleagues already know this, but that most of the humans in Paleolithic art, when they are depicted, and again, there's some funny exceptions, but most of them are faceless. Frankly, there's not a lot of detailing on the bodies either. Like, they tend to be very line drawing. Sometimes they're kind of like that voluptuous shape. Sometimes they're almost like, they call them phantoms. Like, they almost are kind of weird and warpy looking. But considering how good they were with animals, there's got to be something else going on other than them just not being good at human representation. But this example is quite late. I believe it's supposed to be around 11,000 or so, 11, 12. But here they did a beautiful job. There's simple outlines, and yet the muscles are more drawn. Like, there's a better sense of it being quite an aesthetically pleasing image. And if people are able to see, of course, there's some really fun little details in there, like the fact that these people in the middle appear to be hogtied, which, of course, again, we don't find a lot of narrative or story, or at least not that we've really identified in Paleolithic art. It tends to be individual images kind of floating around. And so this is a really fascinating one because it seems to be people, some of them almost seem to have beaks, so maybe wearing masks, maybe they're hybrid animal humans, appear to be moving in a circle around these hog-tied individuals. So there definitely seems to be some sort of story going on there. If they're lucky, it's like a rite of passage. If they're unlucky, it's some sort of sacrifice, was what I was told. That's how it was explained to me when we saw it. But again, it's unusual to see interaction, and so that's kind of a fun, really interesting one that we're seeing there, because we don't see a lot of interaction in Paleolithic art. Now, I think there may be more than we've realized, and again, this might just be a matter of, in a way, I wonder that, like, these categories were set up over 100 years ago now. And I mean, most of us, and again, I know people certainly have challenged it, but it feels like, and I even do it too, I just kind of keep sorting things into like the pre-existing silos, right? And then it's like, well, maybe we need to revisit our way of organizing the art, because certainly in other art traditions around the world, there tends to be a lot more categories. The art tends to be divided up in more fine resolution, often thematically and things like this. Whereas in Europe, we've chosen to group by shape almost. Like, if it's an animal, it goes in the animal category, right? If it's a humanoid shape, it goes in the human category. And then, of course, the third category, which is what I study, are the geometric signs. And again, this is quite the category, because it's basically everything other than the humans and the animals gets like sorted into here, which has made it a very interesting, very large category. It almost feels like a bulging bag that's just like waiting to explode outwards because we just keep stuffing stuff in. And, you know, so again, I've thought a lot about that in the research that I'm doing, which is that, you know, we're grouping it by shape, but there's other ways to create typology, right? Like there's other ways to group things. And so maybe, again, we could also be looking at thematically or based, you know, other parts of the world do that all the time, right? Where, you know, things are being separated off by what they represent or what they're doing with them, right? But at the moment, anyways, the current situation is that geometric signs is this other really big category, which includes, you know, things like the triangles or the rectangles, you know, sort of the grills there, like we can see rows of dots. Here's a whole bunch more for you. So some simple, like we've got our really simple dots sort of on a rock in a cave. These simple sort of cruciforms, so cross-like marks, the X's basically. We've got things like peniforms and would have been called campaniforms, otherwise interpreted as vulvas, because, you know, that's a very favorite default in especially the geometric sign category. And then we have these much more complex shapes, just occasionally, that I would sort of consider an outlier because they're a one-off. Like there's no other shape that looks like this one anywhere. And so these ones are quite interesting too when we find them. But yeah, so the geometric sign category is this massive group of all these different things. This is how I chose to organize them. And again, you know, please take my typology with a grain of salt. I don't think it's the end all and the be all. I think it's, this was me figuring basically, well, I think it was Dr. Georges Sauvé in France. He put it really well, which was that you have to organize them somehow or else you're not going to be able to say anything about anything. Which I think is very, very wise statement. Because again, they don't fit perfectly into these categories, right? Like it's not like every scalariform looks exactly the same. So it's a bit of a judgment sometimes when I'm trying to sort things, but I'm trying to look for things that, you know, have some similarity in appearance, because this is a typology definitely at the moment based on, you know, physical resemblance, right? So that things that look like dots get to go into the dot category and things that look like triangles go together. And so this is currently how it's been based. This is how I've organized it. And like I said, mostly just so I have some sort of base to work with, because again, we can challenge these categories. And certainly in the work I'm doing now, I have started to challenge the idea that, you know, people always ask me like, what's your favorite sign? Which is a funny question. But if I had to pick, one of my favorites is actually the very simple, unassuming dot sign. And I like dots because they're such a great example. They're present at just over 60% of sites have dots. So not all sites, but many sites. They're common. They're the second most common after lines. But dots are a perfect example of one where we sort of group them by their shape, and yet there's some very distinctive ways in which they're being used, which suggest that they had very different meanings in different contexts. And that's what I find quite intriguing about them and why I like them so much. There was a great article that I know some of my colleagues in Spain worked on. I know Diego Garate was, I'm not sure if he was the lead author, but he was certainly involved in that one. And that they were looking at dots at intersections almost in caves as like path markers, which is, you know, such a logical thing to do. For all of you who've crawled around caves, I mean, we all know they can be pretty confusing, and they can be pretty difficult to maneuver around. And again, of course, we have light and, you know, we have all sorts of things at our disposal to help us. But back then, some of these more complicated caves, it might have been very helpful to have a little path marker, you know, wherever it was going. And I know, you know, the path marker goes, you know, all the way back. I've seen it mentioned, you know, even like 100 years ago. And, you know, mid-century, it's been suggested again. So this is an old theory that kind of keeps coming up, and I love it. But Diego and his colleagues, they did a really good job of showing very practically on the ground in some of these complicated caves where some of the dots appeared to be like that. There were other places in the cave too where it looked almost more like somebody brushed the wall on the way by. And so again, these aren't these deep, meaningful marks necessarily. They're more of a byproduct of somebody potentially having ochre either on them, or again, if they've been painting in a cave, maybe they have ochre on their fingers. And so when they grab something as they're, to pull themselves up or do something, they're leaving marks. And so again, not every mark is going to be embedded with deep meaning, right? There could be lots of these very practical things. On the other side, we've got, I've seen some, really interesting stuff as well about the idea that, dots in some contexts could be some form of counting or tallying. So they're suddenly being used in a very abstract, complex way. And there's more explanations as well. One that I'll talk about in a minute, but that is the idea that in some contexts, they almost appear to be representing wounds on the side of animals. And so again, simple dot, but think about all those different ways that they're being used in different contexts. So there's my argument for why the simple dot has, not got enough respect over the years. But I think with many of the signs, we could make that kind of argument, and that's what makes them so powerful. When I'm doing public presentations, I often compare them to emojis, which sounds really funny at first, though it's a good way, again, for the general public to kind of sort of engage with these really old signs. Because, what is an emoji? Emojis are these very simple characters that embed a huge amount of knowledge, much of it cultural. And again, when I'm looking at a phone or a computer, I don't know what half those emojis mean, and I'm scared to use them because I don't want to accidentally say something I'm not trying to. Because again, they are a very complex language in a very simple package. And I feel like with the signs as well, there's the potential for there to be a lot of complexity behind at least some of the signs in some contexts. And so again, when we're approaching them, I'm recognizing that it could be everything from a stumble and a grab all the way up to some incredibly, important, sort of tallying of something that they're using this complex, the sort of at the base of numeracy and counting, right? So the full range of what you can do with the signs. And that's also why I feel like there's so much to be done in this category and so many different avenues that we can use to explore, like symbolic development and cognition using the signs in these different ways. I'm going to talk today, because this is what I was asked to talk about, specifically about the question about writing, because I think it's a fascinating one. And, certainly when my research first came out back in 2009, what was so interesting was that, and I mean, it's one of the things that makes our field so fun for all of us who work in it, is that when you're this far back, like we're talking about the common history of humanity, right? Like this is everybody's story, and it really resonates with the public. I feel like we're lucky. I feel sorry for people who work in fields where, people don't get excited about their research in the same way. Whereas we work in this wonderful field that the public is very interested in, and they want to know more, because this is the ancestors. This is our beginnings, right? But it also means that we have to be really clear about how we're defining what we're seeing. And certainly back in 2009, when my research first kind of went out into the world, almost by accident, it kind of just sort of went, I guess viral wasn't really a thing yet then, but it kind of caught a lot of people's imagination and excitement. And I kept getting asked, was it writing? Is it writing? And I was like, well, no. It's definitely not writing. Writing is much later. But, I didn't have the vocabulary yet to describe it, which is funny. And so for my doctoral research, I had the pleasure of spending quite a bit of time on the linguistic side as well, really delving into, proto-writing and semiotics and trying to understand, how does writing develop, and, where does it fit within the larger context of graphic communication, and how can we look at things that are that old and try and understand how they might relate to what came later. And so, to me, I think it's been a really fascinating journey, and I'm much better equipped now when people are like, is it writing? And I'm like, no, and let me tell you why. But I wanted to show, of course, the La Pasiaga, the inscription, which is what you're seeing here on the screen, since this is one of the ones that, of course, makes people go, well, that looks like writing, right? But it's fascinating. it's one of like, there's so few rows like this. This is not normal. Like, this is not a common way for us to find signs during the Paleolithic. Like, they're not lined up like this. By the end, by the Azilians, so by that very late, like say 10,000 to 12,000 or so, we do start to see a little bit more alignment, especially on portable artifacts. And and even by the Magdalenian, I would say we are so far back as 17,000, maybe even around the late glacial maximum. Things are changing. Things are starting to maybe be a little bit more organized, but overall, you know, we're just not seeing this kind of thing. So, I mean, in a nutshell, writing actually seems like a big hassle to maintain, like a writing system. Like, you need full-time scribes and you need people to like maintain almost like a dictionary, and you know, like there's a lot going on, and it seems like it wouldn't be worth it for some hunter-gatherers to bother having this incredibly complicated like written communication system. You just don't need it. And so I think that's a really important thing to think about as well, is that it's not like an evolutionary track where people who don't have full writing systems are somehow more primitive than people who do. In fact, I think, you know, they're much smarter. What is it? You know, they sort of keep it simple if you can kind of thing, right? And they would have had no need for it. Writing seems to have been incredibly useful starting around 5,000 years ago, when certain groups of people in parts of the world, they started to all live together in these complex, sedentary, city-like states where there was a lot of hierarchy, and frankly, ironically, from the beginning, writing often seems to have been used to oppress the masses. So, you know, from the beginning, it was basically about rules, it was about taxes, it was about what people could and couldn't do. But, you know, again, why would you bother if you live in a group of 20 to 50 people? Like, you could just tell everybody, right? Like, you don't need these complicated systems to like sort of control and rule and, you know, contain. And so I think that, again, writing appears not as some end product of a process, but in these very specific sets of circumstances where it's actually worth the effort of creating an entire class of people to maintain and organize your writing system for you. And so I think that, first of all, that's why we don't have writing during the Paleolithic. Yeah.
In fact, I also personally studied the history of writing, and
yes.
I totally agree that it's the social context is very important for having the writing as we know it, writing system as we know it. Talking about writing, if you permit me, I also wanted to say that another reason why Genevieve von Petzinger is presenting right now is because there is a webinar that is the friends of Centro Camuno know about, that we are organizing around a book of Professor Anati, Emanuele Anati, which is of course the founder of the Centro Camuno di Studi Preistorici. The book that he picked for this webinar to be organized is Origins of Writing. So it's also very interesting because he put the plural, so origins. So as the writing, as we know it, of course, has plural origins. So there is not only one like a linear history, there is a multiple like roots, multiple sources bring into this writing system as we know it. If someone is interested in this webinar, well, unfortunately, it will be in Italian. So if your Italian is sufficiently good, you can be in contact with us. You can write in Facebook to the Centro Camuno, and we will tell you more things. So we also wanted to have these two conferences to be linked by the theme of origins of writing. So sorry to interrupt.
No, I mean, you know, Dr. Anati, again, you know, the research that I do now, and I mean, I think it's always really important to acknowledge that, is built off of research of people like Dr. Anati and Georges Sauvé and Louis Gourin. And there's all of these people who, again, have touched on different aspects. And so I feel like, you know, what I'm getting to work on today is sort of the the end product of all of these different sort of theories and ways of approaching it that they've worked on. So yeah, no, I'm a big admirer of Dr. Anati's work.
And by the way, in the book Origins of Writing, Anati is also talking about dots, and of course there is no one answer of what dots are. This is of course, but he suggested that in many cases they might mean mostly when they are associated with people or animal, so not dots alone. When they are associated with people, they might mean thinking or action. For example, a dot near a bow and arrow means okay, the arrow going. So this is one of his suggestions. But
yeah, no, that's what I mean. Like, yeah, dots, that's being so simple and yet so complex, right? You know, and I think that's really the story with this is that, you know, again, so we're not talking about writing. I think that that's really what I wanted to establish right off the bat is that, you know, when we're talking about the Paleolithic, this is not a writing system. There's not nearly enough characters either, right? Because things like alphabets or these sort of phonetic systems are much later in development. All of the earliest writing systems in the world are based off of, you know, what are known as logograms. So the idea is that the one character represents like a word or a concept or an idea, right? So for instance, with like proto-cuneiform, you've got your little asterisk star, and it represents star or sky. And then I think it gets extended to also represent the sky god as well. But that, you know, one symbol, one concept. And so, you know, again, it takes hundreds, if not thousands, to create a language out of that, as we see with cuneiform and Egyptian hieroglyphs, or with the earliest Chinese writing systems as well. There's huge numbers of characters because you need them in order to represent everything. In Europe, in the Paleolithic, you know, we have 32 plus a few outliers. So that's not nearly enough to map out a language, right? Because writing, again, a true writing system, anything that you can say or think, you should be able to put down in writing. And that's not, we're not even close to that. But I believe like there's some very interesting insights that we can take from all of the linguistic and semiotic research on proto systems and like the proto, like what comes before. And, you know, there are certain things which are found across all of those earliest writing systems, like in their proto stage, which is that we're finding iconic imagery. So basically stylized versions of figurative images. And then also we're finding often some form of counting. And that those seem to be the two elements that make up these proto systems where, again, they're not trying to map everything to language. They've usually got a couple of areas in particular which they tend to thematically have created symbols for. Sort of sadly, so much of it seems to do with economics and business transactions. Appears to have been one of the main underlying reasons why people developed sort of these characters, would be to keep track of bushels of wheat versus like goats or whatever. Though at least in China, they were also interested in like ancestors and there were some spiritual things and some oracle stuff going on as well. But they're very narrow in that sense. There's not as much. And then again, at that point, things are more iconic. You know, cuneiform didn't start out looking like that. It became that. But before that, it was basically picture symbols and numbers. And so I think that is a very interesting insight to take back to look at the signs from the Paleolithic, in the sense that, you know, we're not talking about full-blown symbols yet, probably either. Like, you know, full symbolic writing is something that comes later. That idea of the asterisk suddenly representing a sky god is it's a big cognitive leap that sort of takes place across a writing system forming. And again, there might be a couple of them, but I don't think we're talking about a whole group of them. And that's where, you know, I think in the long run, our geometric sign category is not very tenable as a category. I feel like we need to start carving things out of it and placing them into more, you know, thematically appropriate or categorizing them in different ways, because I don't think we're dealing with all apples in there. I think we've got apples and pears and oranges and bananas, and it's just a big mess. There's a lot of things going on there. And, you know, I wouldn't be surprised if some of the signs do represent some form of counting. And again, that would be very logical based on what we see in those earliest sort of proto-systems is that basically some form of tallying or counting is pretty much universal across all of them. And again, it would make sense during the Paleolithic, counting things, whether that's tallying hunting, hunting kills, or keeping track of seasonal information or lunar cycles. These would be logical things for observant modern minds to start doing. And so I think in that sense, and frankly, they were probably already doing it even earlier, but to have those marks, and especially there's a lot of portable pieces which have sort of interesting sort of tallying marks potentially. So I think that's definitely an area that could use some more exploration. And I think that might help explain what some of the signs are. Like I said, some of them really could genuinely be abstract. There's also been the argument that some of them could be related to shamanism or some form of spirituality. And again, I think it's entirely possible. For me, I think the big thing is that there is no grand unified theory of the signs. I think we're never going to get that. It doesn't exist. I think there's different signs doing different things in different places. And I think that's the reality, is that we're not going to be able to come up with one theory that explains all of them. We're going to have theories which explain certain signs in certain contexts. And so I have no doubt that in some contexts, some of the signs probably are related to religion or spirituality. There's other ones where, again, they really could be like a doodle or somebody smeared something as they walk down the wall. And so I think there's like that full range of what we're seeing. The research I've been doing most recently is looking at what I would call the iconic signs. And so trying to look at this category and say, well, is it possible that some of these signs are in fact stylized images from the real world? Because generally we've categorized the geometric signs, we define them as being objects that are not easily recognizable as something from the mundane world. So therefore they are abstract, they're geometric. But what if some of them aren't? What if some of them actually are real world objects that we didn't recognize them for what they were, or we just got into the habit of categorizing them this way and we've just sort of left them there. And so that was where, based on, again, the earliest proto-systems and the idea that you usually find iconic signs and counting, are there some iconic signs there that we should be looking for? And so I wanted to finish by talking a little bit about the work that I'm doing right now, basically, which is to try and say, are there some there? And then most importantly, though, which is that, I can sit around and theorize all I want, but every one of my colleagues here is like, yeah, but can you prove it? Which is, of course, what science is. And so I've been working really hard to figure out ways to try and prove these things, or at least be able to put forward a good theory for all of you. And so the sign I decided to start with for that was penniforms. And I'm just wrapping some stuff up now, but we can talk about it anyways. We'll talk about it. It should hopefully be out soon. But I wanted to talk about penniforms because I think there's such a no-brainer in a way as a place to start. Penniforms, of course, are sort of defined as these feather-like signs, and yet we often find them on the sides of animals. When we do, we call them wounded animals. So again, we're acknowledging the fact that if you look at its physical shape, it looks like a spear or an arrow. There really is a lot of context for it to be some form of weaponry. And yet when we see them on their own, we tend to refer to them as being penniforms, or ramiforms is another name for them. So we tend to refer to them in that more abstract state. So the research that I just finished doing and that I'm just writing up right now was really fun, because of course what I've been doing for my research is that I've been either using archaeological records and reports from sites and or getting to travel to them myself and document the art. And so I've compiled a database which has all 400 plus of those sites in it. And as much as possible, I have given as great of detail as I can to every single sign that's in those caves. Now, if I haven't visited them, I haven't always been able to get as detailed as I would like, but certainly on the sites that I've visited. And yes, I had a really overly ambitious dissertation project. I worked at 52 rock art sites in 2 years. So that was a whole lot of photographing. But, again, these were sites where, there was something tantalizing or interesting there. And I was like, well, I feel like I want to know more. I want to know like how many of these are there and, getting very detailed. Now, modern reports and modern research projects are always very, very careful now to give a lot of detail when it comes to the signs. But when we go back in time, especially first half of the 20th century, even the late 1800s, a lot of times they didn't pay much attention to the signs. I mean, Abbe Breuil actually called them, parasitic lines and left them out of his drawings because he thought they interfered with the pretty animals. So, again, not always the same level of care and detail was given to the signs. And so some of the caves I visited were ones that had those more general, inventories of 3 bison, 2 horse, and 8 signs. And I'm like, yeah, but what are they? But nobody wrote it down. And so, again, I without having accurate data, how can you say anything, right? And so again, I see my database as kind of like a work in progress. It's not perfect, but it's given me enough detail that I can start playing around and trying out some statistical testing to see if we can find anything. And so using that source, I went and revisited the penniforms. Now, people in the past, there's been several really great studies. Dr. Baffier's done some work. We and Aulette, I believe it is, did some as well. Again, the Deluxe as well have done some work where they've talked about this, where again, they've talked about the idea of wounds, they've talked about the idea of dying animals, they've mentioned the fact that these could be some form of weaponry. And so certainly it's something that has come up. And again, go back even farther in time, and it was something they talked about a lot in the late 1800s, early 1900s. But, they always came at it from the context of the animal. And in most sites, there's not that many penniforms on animals or lines on animals. There's not that many wounded animals. I think overall it's more like 2 to 3% of animals have some form of sign on it that could be related to hunting. When you're looking at it from that point of view, it doesn't seem very important, right? If it's only like 2-3%. What I did was, thanks to my database, I was able to flip that question around and instead ask, if and when penniforms appear, how often do they appear on animals? And I'm so excited to report that it's over 90% of the time. So it's exciting. It was one of those ones where you actually you're like, okay, this is some really great data.
This is interesting.
Yes, I know. So over 90% of the time they appear, and that's the penniforms, they appear on the sides of animals in a context that could very clearly be some form of hunting. So that and this is where again I see the signs as having a lot of value as a way to approach the art, because we can ask these sort of interesting questions from a different perspective or a different angle. And now I'm just working my way through some of the other hunting related signs potentially as well. So things like lines in certain contexts, or dots, or open angles, which of course sometimes appear to almost look like blood sort of coming out of a wound. So there's this whole category that, I'm like, well, maybe we need to talk about whether we need a hunting category. So that again, some of these might be able to be pulled out of the geometric sign category and categorized differently based on them contextually having some meaning. So that's certainly something I think I would love to discuss with our colleagues in the future of could we open up this geometric sign category and look at recategorizing some of the signs, because I think there's some very interesting stuff going on there. And, and it's not just with this, and that's where I just wanted to talk about, some other potentials. The penniforms that don't appear on animals, remember that's only 10% of them, many of them look like these ones, like at Marsoulat or at Lascaux, where again, these could be spears. People have made that argument. Other people have argued they could be some form of grass or wheat, and maybe it's supposed to represent the horse running through a field. Or at Marsoulat, where they look very much like some sort of plant. So again, maybe those aren't penniforms in the same way. Like we're categorizing them based on shape, not on use, right? And so it could be that maybe they need a different name. Maybe they shouldn't be categorized with the same word, right? So these are all things sort of to think about going forward, because again, there's some good arguments have been made for the fact that, they're not just hunters, they're hunter-gatherers. So, again, maybe a blueberry bush isn't as majestic as a bison, so I get it. But you would think that now and then they might also portray trees or plants of some kind. And again, I've seen some work done, you know, Alexander Marshak did some stuff. I know that Paul Bond actually and a colleague did an interesting sort of compilation of all potential example of plants. I think that was back in the 80s they did that. So it's out there, but I feel like it's something that could be revisited further, like that there probably are more examples of plants potentially out there if we went looking for them. So I'd be interested if somebody, myself or somebody else in the future, were able to kind of, you know, delve into that a bit more deeply, because I think it's a very interesting question. You know, not just what's there with cave art, the Paleolithic, but I think what's not there is also a very interesting question too, because there seems to be so many things missing that we find just so automatically in other rock art traditions and that are already categorized, right? And so this is where, are they really missing, or have we just not categorized them in a similar manner? Another one which an entomologist pointed out to me actually was, you know, whether there could be insects being portrayed. You know, so again, one example that caught his attention were these particular marks here that he was arguing could be some form of butterfly. And again, I know I've seen portable pieces where I think there's one that's actually supposed to be a larva of some kind, which is kind of a funny thing to carve. And then also there's the grasshopper I've seen, which is on a portable piece, and I believe it's a French piece. Alexander Marshak has it in his book, and I know other people have studied it too. So
yeah, actually, I think I've seen the original. It's in Paris.
Oh, see,
I think.
Yeah, and that's the grasshopper, right? Which is very clearly, and again, fantastic. Very, yeah. Yeah, so, you know, is there more? And so this is where, again, I think it's these are all questions which I sort of am leaving open-ended because I don't have an answer, but I think they could be worth exploring. How's that? And then, of course, there's other real-world subjects. I love this study that was done in Lascaux. And again, are they right or are they wrong? I think we can argue it. But, you know, the question of whether Paleolithic people looked up is such a fascinating one, because it is kind of weird that we don't have clear examples of sun imagery or moon imagery or potentially star constellations. Like, you would think that would be like, there was no light pollution back then. The sky must have been incredible. And, you know, being able to track, you know, the seasons and cycles would have been really important. And so I do wonder if some of it is sitting there in plain sight, if you will, but that maybe we just haven't really had a chance to dig into it. And again, people have certainly proposed it in the past. It has been mentioned, but, you know, with all the new technology at our disposal, I wonder what we could do. How's that? There's my challenge to us as a field. But, you know, here, the argument they made, of course, was for the Pleiades being right there and that this being Orion's belt. So whether you want to take that as being correct or not, I think it's an interesting proposal. And I think there's a lot more work that could be done, again, with our humble dots. That was the other one I didn't want to mention earlier and spoil my own, you know, future talk. But was it, of course, another thing with dots is that some of them could represent constellations. So there's another one right there. And then there's, of course, the question of, you know, dwellings and daily life. And the Fond de Gaume tectiforms are, of course, an incredible example of, you know, if you look at them, I mean, I hate to say it, but they do look very dwelling-like, don't they? You know, like one of the most looks like it has smoke coming out the top of it. You know, and so, I mean, I think, again, we want to be careful. We don't want to over-interpret, but I do feel, and especially with, there was that great study that I just saw out of Spain there with that portable plaque where they made the argument that it was actually the representation of a hunting village. And so again, I mean, I think there's ideas out there that are starting to be entertained. And of course, there's the wonderful map as well that Dr. Utria and her colleagues have been looking at from the cave of Abance. Where they've made the argument that, you know, there's mountains, there's meandering rivers. And so, you know, and again, of course, Dr. Svoboda in the Czech Republic has made similar arguments with some of the portable pieces from Dolny Vestanichi and Pavlov as well, that some of those could be early examples of mapping. So I feel like, you know, when we're looking at the geometric sign category, that we want to be cautious. We don't want to be like our predecessors in the late 1800s, early 1900s, who were like wildly making theories and like connecting everything and way overusing analogy. But at the same time, I would like to think we could be maybe a little brave, and, you know, and actually explore some of these things and recognize that, you know, with like machine learning and pattern recognition algorithms and so many of the tools that are at our disposal these days, we might be able to start revisiting some of these questions. And I think we might be able to get some interesting results. Again, nothing's going to be 100% for sure, but, you know, even if we could start to slightly better understand it, you know, I mean, I think it benefits all of us, right? It helps to sort of further the information in the field. It will open up new debate. And yeah, so I wouldn't be surprised if somewhere in there were some of these other things were hiding there as well. So these are also things that I would like to explore in the future, or I hope that colleagues of mine will explore so that I can read about their work. So, and I will end it right there. So thank you very much for allowing me to sit here and ramble on about all my crazy theories.
Thank you, thank you. We thank you, Genevieve. It has been a very interesting presentation about your research concerning geometric and abstract science. Of course, the public also has been very happy to hear you talking today. Listen, I have a personal question. Well, first of all, can you tell us about your database a little bit? Because you said you have a database, but that of course is the core of your research.
Absolutely.
How did you do it? How wide is that?
Well, I think what I figured was that, you know, when I first got intrigued by the signs, you know, it was really one of those things where I was like, if we don't have all of the data in one spot, we can't compare and contrast. We can't look for patterns. Like there's all these things that, you know, having it in this one repository is very important. And I should point out, I can't say, you know, quite where yet, but I'm just negotiating with a research institute in order to convert this database into an online resource, which will be accessible to other people as well. And so I'm hoping that that will happen in the next year or so, because they have a wonderful interface they're already using. And I was like, oh, that would be so perfect for my work as well. And so my database is basically a combination of, you know, just basically present. At this point, it's just like more present or absent. I don't have the level of resolution of like, there's 3 dots and that kind of thing at the database level. I have it within the notes for each site. So if you go into the notes, you can get really, really specific in there. But at the upper level, it's more like presence or absence, right? So that, again, it makes it easy to sort, though, to say, well, how many sites have penniforms? And my database, of course, yay, modern technology will answer me in, you know, nanoseconds and tell me exactly how many have penniforms. And then I can sort by time period, or I can sort by region. So there's lots of things.
How many signs do you have? How many entries?
Well, there's about 400 sites in there. The signs themselves, yeah, there's over 5,000 separate entries. So there's a lot. And as much as possible, while I was going along and doing this, I've been collecting photos and drawings and all the archaeological reports. And so I'm trying to figure out a way to like embed all that in there so that way, if somebody goes to the database, they can also see, you know, all of the information that goes in behind it as well. And so again, all those photos that we took at those 52 sites are going to be, I'd like them to be available too, because again, not everybody can travel to those sites and, you know, they can be difficult to work in. And so, you know, having that as a resource for people, I think could be really important. Now, to really lay it out there, in the long run, I would love to be able to expand the database to include other regions of the world by, you know, collaboration and working with colleagues and, you know, starting
like about Camuno.
Yes, exactly. Now you know why you're talking about this, right? Exactly, because again, think about the kind of patterning work, and again, with AI and machine learning, like we're on the edge of this new era where I feel like there's so many technologically assisted things we could do if we had the data in one spot. And that again, there might be patterns sitting right in front of us that none of us have noticed, right? And so the more data that we can start to compile into one location, the more possibilities there are. How's that? So that's my, if I had a dream, that would be my dream. How's that?
It's an older dream of having a worldwide database of rock art, but it has been attempted several times, but I think till now it has not seen the light. Also,
has it worked?
Dr. Anati also, that we talked about earlier, he also had a dream about that. In the 80s, I think, or at least very, very early. So let's hope we can one day
pull it off. See, are you on board? Are you volunteering to come collaborate? Because that's what it's about, right? One person can't do it. You need lots of like people who want to come work together, right? And I think if we could do that, we might be able to. But also, it was a beautiful dream in the 80s, and I'm not surprised Dr. Anati was already thinking that way. That seems to be, he was he's been very prescient that way. But the technology didn't exist, right? I mean, I think you need the World Wide Web. You need all of these incredibly high-tech tools that you can use now that are really opening up all sorts of new questions we can even ask that we couldn't ask before. So yeah, so I'm hopeful. How's that? That's my big dream for the long term.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm sure you can be a big boost for
I hope so.
For this dream.
I'm trying. I tell everybody who'll listen.
Can I also ask you something like another curiosity, if you have an answer to share? What is your opinion about aviforms?
Ooh, aviforms. Yeah. So of course, aviforms are an interesting one because again, they're. I was going to say, let's go back up. Let's show people.
There
we go. All right. So aviforms. Yeah, they're very interesting, aren't they?
I think there was one in a previous image in the writing in La Pasiega. Yeah, I think that's an aviform, right?
It's almost one. Yeah, see, it's got the lines on the inside, almost like a backwards E, but it does have an aviform-like quality to it. And no, I'm so glad you mentioned that. Now, this is something that I haven't even touched on, but that again, really should be, and as you with your background in semiotics, we haven't talked about orientation. We talk about these, but again, if you think about so many symbol systems, the orientation of the sign is absolutely critical to its meaning, right? And so again, if it's facing this, again, if it's one way, it's a W in English. If it's the other way, it's an M, right? Like, just think about that. And again, we've just sort of lumped them together. But again, orientation could actually be rather a critical piece of the puzzle. And aviforms are a good example of that. I've thought that in other locations as well, where depending on how they're oriented, they could be slightly different. And some aviforms have almost more of a curved quality to them. They're not so squared off. So again, it almost seems like different culture groups are using them at slightly different time periods. I believe the curvy ones are a little bit older, and that those straight ones, or I could have it reversed, but that there is some change over time stylistically with them as well. But it is an example. And speaking of that backwards E, it does also exist at another cave in Asturias too. So I find that one quite intriguing, that it's a very unusual sign that exists almost nowhere in Spain, with that type where the lines are on the inside like that, but that it does exist at another cave in the next region over. So often there's those little glimmers of connection, which are quite interesting and suggest some sort of cultural interaction. So how's that? Is that explanation okay for aviforms for you for now? Some people have said they were birds. They could be birds. I mean, it's possible in some contexts they could be. Those type of ones are so hard to figure out though, because again, if you're not a cultural insider, you wouldn't necessarily know. I know that, in modern drawings, I sometimes draw seagulls over the beach looking sort of vaguely like that, but that's just because I can't draw. So, again.
Yeah. I totally understand. I get it.
Yeah.
But also talking about your database again, you didn't, I think that's very, very difficult. You couldn't record associations of symbols, right? Maybe same panel, maybe same.
I haven't. Now, again, if there's somebody who's very smart with databases out there who wants to come and work with me, consider this my shout out to you. You know, I'm sure it's possible in this day and age to get much more complex than what I've done. I kept it really simple, mostly because like I don't have a background in these sorts of programs. And back when I started building it in like 2007, 2008, it wasn't as common. Now, again, I mean, lots of scientists use databases, but it wasn't something where, I mean, now databases are so automated as well. And there's so many cool things you could do that I would be very interested. In a way, I almost sort of like was like, while I was finishing my dissertation, I was like, okay, we just need to lock this in like this and get this part finished. And then I have the rest of my life to play with this. But I feel like we should be able to create associations amongst panels. All of the information is there in the notes. Like, how's that? Like the notes are that I put into in behind are very, very detailed. So it wouldn't necessarily be that hard to do it if we had somebody who had that kind of skill level. How's that? So I think part of it as well is that, you know, for everybody in our field, like there's not that many of us, and we're all like just doing like 10 projects at once, and there's still all these things languishing around that nobody's doing. It's an interesting field that way, that there's actually, I believe, room for a lot more researchers doing a lot more interesting things. So it always feels like I'm like, oh, okay, it's on the list of things to do, right? Along with the other 5 interesting things I want to do.
It seems very like that you can still produce much more work from.
Oh yeah. Oh, well, and another thing too, we haven't even touched on color. You know, does color play a role? You know, it does a red, you know, do triangles tend to be red? I don't have an answer for you. Or I can tell you without hard data, but that it seems like cruciforms, so like that X shape, often appear near horses, which is a super weird thing, but I've just noticed, well, in putting data across so many sites, but I've never pursued it. So, you know, these are the things I'll make a note of when I'm like, it feels like they keep doing it, but I haven't looked at that. How's that? And again, so these are the kinds of things where if this database could be available to other people, maybe somebody else would like to look at that. And, you know, but color is another huge one too, that again, maybe the color of signs is a hugely important part of the sign. You know, and it's something that I haven't even touched on.
Yeah, absolutely. That's fascinating, absolutely fascinating. So Genevieve, I think I can thank you very much also from speaking for all the people that were watching your very interesting communication, and that will continue watching it because it will stay online. On Facebook. We will also put it on YouTube. So we can thank you again, and we wish you good luck for the pursuit of your future research. I know that there's a lot coming, so we are all waiting for the new things, new projects that you are leaning in.
Yes.
So thank you very much, and if you have a last word.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say, no, thank you so much for having me to come talk about it. It was a lot of fun. Hopefully it mostly made sense. But you know, I think, yeah, I feel like I guess the takeaway message is that I feel like there's so much left to still do with the signs. I mean, and it's too much for one person. I mean, I think there's so much that so many people could do. And I think it speaks to our field in general that, you know, we're in this very exciting time in the field where there's so many different ways to approach things. There's so many cool questions to ask. That, yeah, I feel like the next decade is going to be a very exciting time in paleoanthropology. So I hope you all stay tuned. Whether it's me or somebody else, I have a feeling that there'll be lots of exciting discoveries coming our way. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So bye-bye, everybody.